Howdy folks, my name is Gabriel Sines. I'm going to read a bit of a academic paper here for you because I thought it was a really good example of how research or academia-based writing could be really troubled by the tone and the way it is written. A lot of academic writing is written in a very difficult to understand way that's very unusable by laymen and can sometimes be really unusable even by other researchers. The thing is, researchers can, just like anyone else, I'd be subject to unconscious drives, unconscious self-esteem problems, unconscious need to feel and show that what they're doing is important. And especially for researchers, that last one is dangerous because as a researcher, you have a constant need to demonstrate to the people in your area and the people who are judging you, who decide whether or not you deserve grant money, who decide whether or not you deserve tenure, that what you're doing is important and highly intelligent. What that means is that a lot of times when people write academic stuff, they should write it as clearly and easily and accurately as possible, but actually they write it, yes, conveying the information they should, but with so much jargon and just wordiness that it makes it really hard to read something. You get the idea that the person who wrote it is really smart and knows a lot of stuff, but it's really hard to understand what they're saying, and a lot of times they can say very little in a lot of text, and I think this is a very good example of this. I'm not saying that the work associated here is bad. I'm just saying that the people who wrote this clearly have a twofold mission. Number one, to give information, and number two, to show how important and intelligent and well-designed this information was. So I'm just going to read maybe like the first page, maybe the first 2 pages, just to show you how, yes, they are giving out information, but no, it's not written very well because it's really wordy. It includes a shit ton of jargon, and it just makes it really hard for the actual pieces of information to come across. For anyone who's not familiar with how academic writing works, you always have a couple of things at the beginning, where the writing comes from, the title of the writing, who wrote it, directions for who wrote it, an abstract, which is supposed to tell you what like the whole thing is about. It's like this tells you the whole story, ideally, without any details. And then keywords so that people can search your thing, and then the writing. So this is kind of an editorial piece. It's not associated with any specific research or studies or anything like that, but it's a sort of an explanation to a new paradigm in how we should research psychological disorders, moving away from the DSM. The DSM is the kind of the standard diagnostic manual for identifying mental illnesses like depression or PTSD or schizophrenia. And overall, what it's trying to say is that this new thing, the RDoC framework, is all about understanding how individual systems range from appropriately functioning neuropsychological systems to not working neuropsychological systems. Whereas the DSM is mostly oriented towards one, diagnosing illnesses from symptoms. So it kind of umbrellas symptoms into a single diagnosis. And two, it makes it really difficult to understand what's going on in a patient because it's very strongly based on, is this person normal or abnormal? Whereas the RDoC framework is really big on this idea of scales. So there is like from 0 to 100%, not necessarily normal or abnormal, but to function to dysfunction. And every single person in the world is somewhere on that scale. Nobody is either yes, completely broken, or yes, completely functional. So it is a cool paradigm. It is an interesting paradigm. It is one that's kind of revolutionizing archaic thought about mental illness. But it seems to me that the way this is written, it's trying to get to clinical psychologists maybe who might look at this initially and think pompously, oh, well, they're just trying to tell us to do something that we've never done before, so it's all wrong. Um, it's really written in a sort of way that's supposed to sound really intelligent and well thought out. I think to kind of give the effect of making you think, yeah, whoever wrote this is super smart and we should definitely do what they're saying. In addition, this is really obviously and backed by funding agencies. It constantly says research agencies that give you money for research say you should do this and this and this and this and this. And it also has some parts where it's like, look, we're not saying that you have to change completely. We understand that there needs to be a transitional period. So here are some things that are important to do during that transitional period, but eventually we need to move entirely to the RDoC framework, and I don't care if you want to keep using DSM stuff. So it's got this sort of multifacetedness to this paper. Number one, it's trying to tell you about the RDoC framework and how it's different from DSM. Number two, it's trying to sound really smart and intelligent and well thought out so that scientists in clinical psychology will really trust this and believe that it's good instead of immediately rejecting it. And number three, it's saying, well, although it's really well thought out and you should accept it because it is so well thought out, we're the ones who have the money, so you should really follow us, okay? All right, let's get down to the stuff. One of the most important things to understand in academia is that when you're reading a paper, you will come across this issue of the text versus the meaning very often. And it's important to develop the capacity to read text and then simplify it, summarize it into actual meaning. Academic writing always has a lot of fluff. Maybe not necessarily stuff that's useless, but definitely stuff that's not useful to you in understanding what's going on. A lot of times there are details that you don't care about. A lot of times there are things that are included because a lot of different types of people will read the same writing, and so it should try to appeal to as many people as possible, so only some of those things will appeal to you as a person or as a researcher. And a lot of times it's just fluffy because, again, it's trying to make itself feel smart and important. Okay, so let's get started. One quick note. Here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to use a funny voice in reading the text, partially to make it a little bit more interesting, partially to delineate that that's not me speaking, I'm just straight up reading it. And then I'm going to use my regular voice when I'm trying to summarize what it's saying and complaining about it. As I've already read this once, and I sort of got it. With any of this type of writing, you can always read it 10 or 15 times and get more out of it, because it is very thick, it's dense with information, and you won't ever get all of it in one read. But it's important to be able to take away the main points so you can understand the whole thing before you try to understand the little minutia. So yeah, I'm not trying to, well, yeah, I'm a little bit, I'm trying to ridicule it, because as I was reading it, it bothered me how difficult it was to read this and how little they say in how many words. But I'm not trying to insult anybody, not Bruce Cuthbert. This is something that's a problem in all of academia. It's because, just like career-based politicians, career-based scientists have to do everything they can to appeal to the people who are judging them and to each other. So it's a problem in science today that results in this sort of writing, and how you choose to organize your writing and your writing style is dependent on a lot of stuff. So I am making fun of it, but I'm making fun of this problem in academia, not any individual person or group of scientific stuff. Okay, let's get started. Forum, the Research Domain Criteria Project, Promise and Limitations. Okay, that doesn't really tell me very much other than this was like from a conference, and it's about RDoC, Research Domain Criteria Project, and why it's good and why it might be bad. After having read the whole paper, I didn't really see anything that constituted a limitation. It may be that there was more writing that I didn't get to look at. It may be that, but yeah. Let's move on. can't really get too much out of that first thing. The RDoC framework facilitating transition from ICD-DSM to dimensional approaches that integrate neuroscience and psychopathology. I actually really like that title. After having read the paper, it really does tell me what's going on. Before having read the paper, it didn't really tell me too much, so just to kind of tell you what's going on, well, I've already sort of said it. The title means this new RDoC system is set up to see people and mental illness and dysfunction in terms of scales as opposed to umbrella diagnoses. The DSM did umbrella diagnoses, and the RDoC is all about scales. And this paper is trying to explain how to transition from a DSM form of thinking to an RDoC form of thinking, as well as how the RDoC incorporates neuroscience and psychopathology, i.e. just clinical psychological research or abnormal psychological research. I'm not sure if that's exactly what that means. Actually, let's just do a quick Google search, make sure I'm right about that. The scientific study of mental disorders, features of mental health. Yeah, okay, I was right. A lot of scientific reading is looking at words and getting pretty good at guessing what they mean, not necessarily knowing what each word means. For people who are really new to reading academic papers, there is never, ever anything wrong with looking up at what a word means. Just be careful, because in scientific writing, a lot of times the word means whatever the writer is trying to say it means, not necessarily what it might mean in real English. A lot of times individual areas of psychology have their own meanings for words. A lot of times individual people within each area have their own meaning for words, and those people will claim that my meaning is the right meaning and this is the only meaning that it's got, and that's garbage. You have to be very careful when you're reading words to know that you understand what the writer meant it to mean. Just one of the many wording problems in science. Okay, moving on. Let's check out the abstract. In 2008, the National Institute of Mental Health, NIM, included its new strategic plan the following aim. Develop for research purposes new ways of classifying mental disorders based on dimensions of observable behavior and neurobiological measures. Let's make sure I understand what this sentence means. The National Institute of Mental Health, also known as the government system that gives you money for clinical psychological research, decided that it wants to develop new research, develop new reasons for research and new ways of classifying mental disorders based on the dimensions of observable behavior and neurological measures. So instead of trying to classify people into mental disorder types or groups, we want to better understand how observable behavior and observable neurobiological information can be understood in terms of scales of problems, scales of function or dysfunction. So that sentence has about as many words as it should, but maybe for people who aren't familiar with this type of writing, it would be a bit difficult. The implementation of this aim was named the Research Domain Criteria Project, or RDoC. RDoC is a programmatic initiative that will fund grants, contracts, early phase trials, and similar activities for the purpose of generating studies to build a research literature that can inform future versions of psychiatric nosologies based on neuroscience and behavior science rather than descriptive phenomenology. All that says is that RDoC is a part of NIM, and it's going to fund research based on its own new framework of scale-based observable information from observable behaviors and neuroscience instead of descriptive phenomenology, which basically means just naming things. Descriptive phenomenology is a perfect example of this writer used an absurdly convoluted term to reference the fact that in the DSM we give names, we give like umbrella names to mental disorders, where it might be better to look at just symptoms instead of a whole, like, say, okay, this person, low energy, not moving their body very much, having low quantities of emotions, they're depressed. Okay. Depression doesn't necessarily mean that. Depression has a lot of possible symptoms, but that's what we're calling it. So that's what it means by descriptive phonemiology. Also, it's important to say that RDoC gives you money. RDoC is going to fund research based off of how we want research to be done. When I first read this phrase, nosologies, I thought it was funny because it knows science. Is that what it means? I don't know. I'm going to look that up. I want to find out what nosologies means. Nosology, a branch of medical science dealing with the classification of diseases. Okay, so it's just a repetitive way of saying, again, descriptive phonemiology. Annoying. So in this case, it's saying that we're going to fund research in our own way so that future styles of diagnosing or naming mental illnesses can be based on neuroscience and behavioral science instead of just naming things, which is, you can kind of see how it goes along with the same thing I've been saying, but in actuality what they wrote isn't very well written, in addition to being really verbose and overly fancy with its wording. RDoC departs markedly from the DSM and ICD processes, in which extensive work group meetings generate final and finely honed sets of diagnoses that are modified in field tests only if problems with clinical utility arise. Okay, so this sentence says, RDoC is different from the current DSM system because in the current DSM system, scientists come up with names and diagnoses and then change them only if problems come up afterwards, and it doesn't actually say how it's different from it. It just says how the DSM does it, but this sentence is kind of written in a judgmental sort of way if you pay attention to it. Rather, in keeping with its provenance as an experimental system, the RDoC provides a framework for conducting research in terms of fundamental circuit-based behavioral dimensions that cut across traditional diagnostic categories. Oh boy, this one's really pompous. All it's saying is, unlike the stuff in the previous sentence, what RDoC does is research mental illness using circuit-based behavioral dimensions, i.e. neuropsychological and observable behavioral measures that do not really care about traditional DSM styles of diagnosis. While an important aim of the project is to validate particular dimensions as useful for eventual clinical work, an equally important goal is to provide information and experience about how to conceive and implement such an alternative approach to future diagnostic practices that can harness genetics and neuroscience in the service of more effective treatment and prevention. Okay, so this says two things. Number one, this first half of it is that its goal is to check whether or not this scale system is really a thing. It's not really saying that. It's saying to check whether or not, or to try and find what are scales that are good ways of thinking about mental function or dysfunction, the scale from 0 of no function to 100% function. And the other thing is also the RDoC framework, and this paper is about telling you how you can design studies towards this goal if you're used to designing studies towards DSM style goals. This paper summarizes the rationale for the RDoC project, its essential features, and the potential methods of transitioning from DSM-ICD categories to dimensionally oriented designs and research studies. So I'm not sure if it said this in the previous sections, but it just kind of reiterates stuff that I've already said. This paper is going to tell you how to do research in the RDoC way if you are used to doing research in the DSM-ICD way. Okay, all right. Let's move on. Actually, let's critique their keywords. Psychiatric diagnosis, fine. Research domain criteria, okay. RDoC, sure. NIM. You ever seen the movie The Secret of NIM? It's a good one about anthropomorphic mice who've been tested on DSM-5, transitional research. It would probably have been better to get rid of the 5 here, but oh, okay. This is fine. Sometimes the keywords for stuff is really bad. Translational research is weird. They talk about it over the course of this paper. Let's see what it might mean. Translational research is the process of applying knowledge from basic biology and clinical trials to techniques and tools that address clinical needs. Unlike applied scientists, translational research is specifically designed to improve health outcomes. Okay, so basically, translational research, which kind of sounds like it's like going from English to Spanish research, or maybe more intelligently moving from one area of research to a different area of research. In this case, it specifically means using research to inform clinical, psychological, and psychiatric practices. Okay. Um, that's an example of a term that's obviously like within this field, but people who are not used to this area of stuff wouldn't really be familiar with it at all. Okay, let's move on. I'll try and keep this thing under an hour. Is this all one paragraph? No, there's 3 paragraphs on this first page. I hope you can already see how, as a consumer of academic writing, you have to be really good about reading something and then writing it in your own way, in your own mind, because the way stuff is written in academia can be really difficult to parse, and it's important to also observe the like subtleties of what information people are kind of trying to get across without directly saying it. So let's get into some of this text. A lot of this is going to be pretty repetitive because this whole paper is goddamn repetitive. Maybe I'll skip towards the end after I read one paragraph here. A spirited debate about psychiatric diagnosis broke out on the eve of the DSM release, following a blog post by the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Dr. Thompson Insel. As Insel, Dr. Thomas Dr. Thomas Insel, entitled Transforming Diagnosis. One, in this case, is one way of referencing citations, references. I like this way of just putting a number down, and then down here you can look at the number. Other systems of references kind of suck. Okay. In this post, Dr. Insel reviewed the common consensus in the research community regarding the problems with the DSM system, i.e., diagnoses based on presenting signs and symptoms that have acceptable reliability but have increasingly been shown not to represent valid disease entities. Instead, he stated that the NIM would reorient its research away from the DSM-5 towards NIM's Research Domain Criteria Project, RDoC, developed to explore ways to incorporating such methods as genetics, neuroaging, and cognitive science into future diagnostic schemes based on behavioral dimensions and neural systems. This is, I mean, it's a little wordy, but I think this bit's pretty easy to understand. Basically, the DSM-5, it's a number 5 because it's been revised over and over again, and the reason it's been revised over and over again is because people are coming to understand that just giving mental disorders a name is the wrong way to deal with them because they are almost always individual, they're different in every person that they pop up in, and multifaceted. Whereas traditional medical science, naming a disease is good because a lot of the times the cause or the effects of the disease are consistent. So it doesn't really mention traditional medicine, but I think that's why the DSM is set up this way, which for mental illness is not how things work, i.e., body problems and illnesses are simple, so we can just name them and therefore understand how they work, or at least understand what we should look at. Mental illnesses and diseases are more complex because the brain is so interconvoluted that we can't just look at them as names. We need to look at them as multidimensional, individual, facetal issues with different diagnostic criteria and response requirements. All right, done being stupid. The ensuing online discussion was unfortunately misguided in that the post was addressed to the research community and in particular to potential peer reviewers of the RDoC research grant applications, rather than to observers of the DSM-5, and the debate has subsided following a joint press release by the NIM and American Psychiatric Association that reaffirmed that agencies shared interest in psychiatric diagnosis and the important role played by the DSM in clinical use. So this guy made a post on his blog that pissed off a bunch of DSM folks, particularly because it was aimed at people who are interested in doing RDoC-based research, and it kind of sounded like we're not going to fund DSM research, and the DSM is stupid. it doesn't directly say so, but that's a good explanation as to why the whole paper is really trying to get DSM people on board. So maybe this is a really response type of paper. It's maybe trying to triage social problems caused by that blog post and by various other things. Basically, it really seems like the DSM folks, people who research clinical psychology stuff, were really unhappy with this new RDoc initiative. All right. Let's skip forward to a random other paragraph. It's not super necessary to understand the previous bits to understand each individual paragraph the way this is written. So that's something that's cool and important to understand in academic writing, even though things are written in a straight line because we have to read in a straight line. You really don't have to or should read academic papers from top to bottom. So if you want to read an academic paper well, probably what you should do is read the abstract, read the last couple of paragraphs. There's a couple other places that you should read first and then move on. That lets you create a framework in your mind of what's going on before you go to the nitty-gritty parts, which are going to be kind of glued and mortared in between all of the main pieces of writing. One way to kind of make sure that you do get a fresh start if you're skipping around is to find a subheader. A lot of times these are specifically, we're going to be talking about a whole different thing now. You don't even need to know the previous stuff to know this stuff. All right. Excuse me. What does the RDoc involve? The financial statement of the RDoc goal, develop for research purposes new ways of classifying mental disorders, could be inferred to mean that NIM has created a fully fledged new nosology that is now ready to field trials. So this sentence says, what's RDoc about? Well, if you look at the writing on the website for RDoc, it says that we're trying to create new ways of classifying mental disorders. And that kind of suggests that we're coming up with a new nosology, i.e. a new way of naming mental disorders. Okay, that's what this sentence says. It's a bit convoluted, especially for people who aren't familiar with what this says. This is misleading. Thank you. You should have put this at the beginning. What does RDoc involve? The writing on RDoc can be misleading because it says this. But there's it's written that way to be really theatrical. And it's like, where does theatricality fit in science and research? Actually, it's very, very important to science and research because everything a scientist does is geared to make them look better towards their peers, towards their funding agencies, towards their betters. So science is full of theatricality because it's our career, and we are constantly, as scientists, competing to gain funding or jobs or whatever. So just me complaining about this system. In fact, the goal of RDoc is to foster research to validate dimensions defined by neurobiology and behavioral measures that cut across current disorder categories and can inform future revisions of our diagnostic systems. So all this says is RDoc is about coming up with dimensions of mental function, or maybe variables that we can use that are based by neuropsychological and behavioral measures, which will ignore existing mental disorder categories, so we can come up with better versions of diagnostic systems. I don't want to say that again, but if you need to hear it again, just play it back. In other words, RDoc is intended to support research towards a new classification system, but does not claim to be a completed system at the current time. To the contrary, RDoc represents a framework as conducting research on psychopathology in the ways that diverge markedly from current standards. I.e., we're different from existing research systems. We don't say that we know exactly what we're doing, and we're not a completed style of research, but we're different from DSM. It's very repetitive here. The ultimate goal of is to build a research literature that reflects advances in genetics, other areas of neuroscience, and behavioral science to provide a foundation for precision diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. This sentence really sucks. It says, what we want to do is create a research literature that is based on new things in neuroscience and behavioral science, so we can diagnose better. All right. Structure of the Haddock matrix. Let's skip over here. The major elements of this organizational scheme can be represented as a two-dimensional matrix. This literally just means a table. Check figure 1. It's a table. It's a table that has columns for different types of dimensions, like gene-based dimensions, molecule-based dimensions, cell-based dimensions, circuitry, and you can kind of see this is roughly moving upwards in physical size, and then physiology, behavior, and self-reports. So here we're still moving towards physical size, but over here it's like visible problems where this is like sub-eye level stuff. And then paradigms is like how are you going to look at that stuff. And then here are the things that could be associated with those things. So here's an example of a nauseatingly overcomplicated phrase to mean the major elements of RDoc can be understood as a table with dimensions of size and domains or areas of investigation. The various dimensions referred to above appear in the rows of the matrix. They are formally termed constructs to denote their status as non-computable concepts based on convergent sets of data, whose precise functional significance changes as increasing amount of data are compiled to inform our understanding. So we're going to call these rows areas of research. We're going to call them formally, so we are now going to take hold of the word constructs to mean that they're kind of vague things. They're not necessarily mathematically produced or scientifically produced, but they are based on different areas of research that all sort of point to them being related types of topics. And they're important because as time goes on, there's scientific evidence that they're important. See this reference that shows that they're important. The constructs are grouped within the superordinate domains, the research domains, as noted above, reflecting significant relationships among constructs within each domain, besides providing a heuristic organizing scheme, i.e., what it's saying here is that these individual rows of things are gathered under bigger groups or categories because they're related. This is particularly nauseatingly overwritten. Okay, let's do next paragraph because this is a good example of how this writing is crappy and says very little, but is big on feeling strong and smart. The 7 columns of the matrix represent various classes of measurement that could be used to assess each construct and are termed units of analysis. That is also a column to represent various paradigms used to assess the construct. As noted above, entries for each cell as defined by the intersection of a row and column were nominated and vetted by the workshop participants. The center column refers to the measurement of particular brain circuits. The 3 columns to its left denote respectively the genes, molecules, and cells that comprise circuits, while the columns to the right can be thought as various circuit outputs, behavior, psychological responses, and verbal reports, or clinical completed instruments. The latter 3 columns include measures that could be used to assess signs and symptoms from various self-report or interview-based instruments. Let me summarize that. Basically, what it's saying is this is a table. We're going to use this to organize all of the scales that we want to use in diagnosing and treating mental illnesses. The way this table works is there are columns associated with what the scale is about, either genes or cells. These are things that are inputs or the physical things in the body that are causing the issues. And on the right, physiology, behavior, and self-reports. These are things that are outputs or maybe symptoms of mental illness. And over here, paradigms, that's a very commonly used word in science to mean how we gonna look at it? How we gonna study it? What do you use to understand negative valence systems? And so what it's saying is that each little cell here should be a scale or quantity of scales related to molecules and related to loss in emotions. Valence means emotions. Or over here, let's try a different one. This cell is scales associated to physiology, so physical medical symptoms associated to attention in cognitive processes. So what are the physical scales associated with attentional problems? You know? So like maybe somebody who has ADHD has like other physical symptoms, like they have maybe increased heart rate because they're moving their brain around and they're trying to put in more information than fits at a moment, something like that. I don't know. I just made that up on the spot. I don't know if ADHD has anything associated with it. That's the point. You get it. That whole like overwritten sentence is saying this is a table to organize our scales. It is based on science. All right. Let's skip forward again. Let's do one more because this is starting to get a bit longer than I want it to be, and I want to go to one of these paragraphs that was particularly bothering to me. This here. We'll do these two after this section here, and then we'll be done. Transitioning from DSM to RDoC. What could a prototypical RDoC research design look like? Such an experiment would include subjects with a wide range of normal to impaired functioning with respect to the dimensional constructs of interest, while many studies would employ enriched sampling of subjects who evince, ooh, what a fancy word, levels of impairment consistent with the current diagnostic criteria. The focus would be extensively on the RDoC constructs without recourse to the DSM diagnoses of the design. All this says, when you're doing RDoC style research, you should get a wide range of research participants. You should not limit your research participants to DSM, the categories, if you are interested in particular ones, because we need to look at a whole range from unfunctional to fully functional people. So that's one major difference from RDoC to DSM. We're going to include a wider range of people in our studies. This isn't really something that's like fantastically innovative in research. If you ask any research level student, like level 1, how do you do research student, a very common answer is to get a greater sample, a greater quantity of people when you're doing any study. That'll help you understand what's going on better. And it's like, Hadoi. But it kind of overwrites this again because DSM folks are very used to, like, you'll get in a research study about depression, you'll get somebody who has heavy depression, people who have weak depression, people who has no depression, and nothing in between, and nothing on the extremes. So RDoC's different because it does want you to get things in between, and it does want you to get things on the extreme. So, you know, it's really overwritten. Again, I know. It's the reason I'm restating stuff, partially because that's just the way I speak, partially because this type of writing can really bother me, because it's trying to make itself sound smart and important, it makes it inaccessible to more people. Which science is all about, being accessible to more people. One of the most important things that makes humans good is because they can communicate information. They can understand things that someone else made up. Okay, settle down. Let's continue. It is acknowledged that for the foreseeable future, these diagnoses will be needed for medical records and insurance purposes. Yes, we know the DSM is mostly all about insurance. If you didn't know that, it is, and this is my opinion. I'd say that the majority of the reason that the DSM has been created is so that we can insure people. If you have this quantity of symptoms, that means that your life is bad enough that your insurance will pay for your treatment or your drugs. Anyway, move on. At the extreme, for example, samples for a study of reward circuit activity as relevant in anhedonia and or mania might be drawn for virtually the entire population of treatment-seeking adults. Mood, anxiety spectrum, psychotic spectrum, eating disorders, personality disorders. For appropriate exploration of dimensionality, the sample would also include relatively minor psychopathology, such as an adjustment reaction diagnosis, as well as those individuals who do not meet any criteria for a diagnosis. Okay, this whole thing literally just says if you want to do a study which has a super amazing, perfect set sample of people, you would get people in your area of interest. In this case, I use an example of reward circuit stuff, and they put in a bunch of stuff that literally just makes it harder to understand what you're reading here. But it just says, as an example, if you want to research this stuff, you should also include people in this with this types of disorders. And you should also include people who don't have the disorder, so that related disorders and undisordered people can be studied together to see how they are different. That's all that says. A similar approach might be used to study executive function in children across a range of autism spectrum, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and mood anxiety disorder, and once again, those who do not meet criteria for any disorder. So this might be really confusing for a person who's unfamiliar with this type of writing. It literally just says, another example of how you might gather participants is if you are looking at children who have autism. Children who have autism, all of this says if you want to study who have children who have autism, then you should also get participants or children who have these other types of things, which are related disorders, as well as people who don't have disorders. Okay? Do you get it? You're supposed to sample widely. That's all this whole paragraph says. All right, paragraph 2. I think this entire next paragraph literally just says the same thing. So we're going to skip it. I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure it does. I think this next paragraph, next 2 paragraph, is about transitioning from DSM to RDoC. So it's kind of throwing the DSM folks a bone to say, look, we're not going to require you to immediately do this super huge sampling and scaling system. So we're gonna level with you during a transitional period. Okay, let's see what it's got to say. Designs such as those above, vastly oversimplified here for brevity, may be considered the gold standard in terms of RDoC's instantiation. Ooh, that's $1 million word. Let's check out what it means. The program instantiation is the creation of a real instance of a particular realization or an abstraction of template. Okay. The definition for this word is over complicated. Instantiation means in this case. Let's try this again. Designs such as those above, vastly oversimplified here for brevity, may be considered the gold standard in terms of RDoC's case, in this case of RDoC, of the corresponding goal in the NIM strategic plan. I.e., this is one way that this is an over-exaggeration of the best possible way you could do RDoC-based research according to NIM's goals. Accordingly, a critical aspect of the RDoC program is helping research make the transition, both conceptually and practically, from the ICD-DCM to a dimensional outlook. So here's a mistake. Here's a hot tip for anyone who writes anything ever. If you are writing a lot of information with multiple paragraphs, you should always try and focus a paragraph on one topic. And you can do this by having your first sentence be the topic sentence for the whole topic. Your first sentence should tell the reader what the rest of the paragraph is going to be about. This sentence fits with the last paragraph. This should be the topic sentence for this paragraph. So it bothers me that this writer isn't using that system. You don't have to use that system, but it improves understanding of reading exponentially. But obviously this person doesn't care about understanding of reading. He cares about sounding really smart. The DSM people will get off his ass. Okay. Accordingly, as a critical aspect of the RDoC program, it is helping researchers make the transition, both from conceptually and practically, for ICD-DSM to a dimensional outlook. This has been a matter of ongoing concern for the DSM work group, as the DSM-ICD system... Why did they flip this here? Inconsistency is a mistake in writing. As the DSM-ICD system has been used for so long in research and clinical practice that some transition is needed to consider psychopathology and other perspectives. Okay, this is a hella repetitive thing saying, look, we getcha. You've used DSM-style research forever. So, part of the RDoC initiative is to help you transition from DSM to RDoC. Okay? We're going to help you do that. Because you've used it for so long that you need it, you stupid peasants. These issues would depend not only on becoming accustomed to the significance of new scale values, such as anhedonia or working memory, but also on achieving a mental model for patients seen through the RDoC lens. The same psychopathology could be present, of course, but conceived and measured in different ways. This whole sentence says, you're going to be using the same information that you have in the past, DSM people, but we want to help you think about it in our way, because our way is better. The general approach to this transition would incorporate various combinations of RDoC constructs and DSM-ICD disorder categories in experiments. While these steps may be useful in transition, there are potential drawbacks as well. So literally, so far, the only thing that this has said is that the RDoC is different from DSM in that the DSM is based on categorizing and diagnosing patients, whereas the RDoC is based on using scales of people, and we can understand the scales better by getting wider range of samples. And this is apparently so hard for the DSM researchers that we have to put a huge focus on helping them transition. But we understand that transitioning can be dangerous. We might mistake transitional period for making little to no change and then staying with that little to no change. And that's not what we want. So let's make sure that we don't make mistakes during this transitional period. I just said a whole lot more than is written here. But the reason being, there is a whole lot more between the lines. I think that this bit here comes off really condescending. One problem is the temptation of the disorder categories to remain privileged with respect to the dimensions. Investigators might continue to regard the diagnostic thresholds as demarcation points for ill versus well, and also continue viewing pathology through the DSM-ICD lens rather than acclimating to the idea of neurosystems-based functional constructs. So all this is saying is, well, we're going to be helping you by slowly moving towards the system. We don't want you guys to use your categorization system forever. We want you guys to use our categorization system eventually. And you guys are so dumb that some people might be stuck using their DSM system. But they use privileged, and like they're really only going to use it. And it's true, yes. Whenever you're moving from one way of doing something to another way of doing something, people don't like the change. And some people will take advantage of the transitional, extra bit of rope they give them, the looseness of the transitional period to get stuck in their ways and not really make an effort to transition. So they don't want that. So this is a reasonable thing, but it's said in a pompous and wordy way. There is an also obvious potential bias in sampling mostly patients who meet current diagnostic criteria in treatment-seeking samples or in other recruiting strategies, thus short-circuiting dimensional exploration. So the one thing we wanted you to do is to use larger samples, and because we're going to give you a transitional period, it's possible that some people won't use that transitional period to get those bigger samples and therefore are scale system isn't gonna work. Please do it, guys. Come on. In short, these transitional steps pose the risk that investigators will continue to regard their patients both clinically and in terms of research designs and familiar DSM terms, failing to grow a sufficient appreciation for the precision medicine zeitgeist that RDoC is intended to facilitate. This is just self-indulgent bullshit. Let's see what zeitgeist means. I'm pretty sure it's like style. German word for style, the defining spirit or mood a particular period of history is shown. Yeah, there it is. For these reasons, transitional research designs are best regarded as temporary heuristics for a limited number of studies in the full potential of the RDoC framework to be reached. I.e., we're going to give you some room so that you can make the change slowly, but it's not going to be permanent. Eventually, we're going to get harder on you and make you have to do it, so make use of the transition time we're giving you. Make use of it. Yeah, they go on to do all this stuff. Like, it's, I hope you really get an idea of how overwritten and overcomplicated this stuff is to say really very simple ideas. This is maybe why if you do research and then you look at popular science versions of the research, people who write articles for the public explain the articles in really easy to understand ways. And yes, they don't say everything from the article, but anyone can read it and get it. And then you look at the actual paper and it's this convoluted mess of wordiness. And this is an example of something that I believe is particularly bad. But all research papers have this jargon, egocentric pompousness issue. And it's not a problem with the person having egocentrism. It's just, this is the style of the day. And if you don't write like this, people won't like you. That's just what it is. One problem with psychology is that in a lot of places, psychology is still considered a liberal art. Technically because, or it can be considered a humanity because liberal arts are the studies of humans. It's not really considered a science because it's not super science-y. So part of this is like psychologists have always kind of have to dealt with this shame of like, we're not a real science, so we have to really work to be credible. So maybe it's partially due to the history of distaste. Let's move on. We're not going to read the conclusion paragraph because it's just highly repetitive. And it's really like, it doesn't say anything new at all. We'll read the penultimate paragraph here. Similarly, development of new treatments may be facilitated by the identification of more homogeneous subgroups of patients. Okay, so this paragraph basically says RDoC can be used not just for diagnosis, but also for treatment. This is actually a pretty good paragraph, actually. Let's read this one. I like this paragraph. It tells you a lot, and it's not super pompous, so let's read this one too. While the above steps have been oriented towards psychopathology, there are relatively near-term possibilities using RDoC concepts in treatment as well. This just says, we were talking about research, but we can use RDoC to change how we treat people. The common element for any treatment trial in RDoC will require the development of a valid set of measures that can reliably distinguish a particular subtype or critical location along a dimension to predict successful treatment outcomes, i.e., RDoC's all about coming up with scales that can predict if you do this, then this will happen. Therefore, we should be able to predict what things will work and what things won't work. This is a problem because of this next part here that they're going to talk about. As one example, given the well-known heterogeneity of ICD-DSM categories, establishing mechanically based subtypes of current disorders may enhance matching for participants to treatments. Okay, that just says what I said. Unlike DSM, which is all about categorizing people and diagnosing people, we're going to deal with scales of problems, so like individual symptoms of problems, and deal with those instead of the disease itself. So we're treating symptoms and underlying issues of those symptoms, not we're treating disease. For instance, PTSD is often regarded as a prototypical fear circuit disorder, i.e., for example, PTSD is about fear. However, many participants with PTSD show a blunted affective response to affective changes, which may relate to multiple traumas and/or a chronic course. Affect is a word for emotions in psychology. So, although PTSD is usually considered all about being afraid or fear, some people who have PTSD actually exhibit lack of emotions to things that should cause emotions. And that may be associated to multiple traumas or chronic cores. So like if you've had lots of really, really scary situations, maybe you'll stop having fear as a defense mechanism. And that's a form of PTSD too. And this next paragraph is just going to say, so those two different types of PTSD. PTSD of too much fear and PTSD of no fear should be dealt with differently. And that's how RDoC is important. And it is. That's a good way to think about things, because currently with the DSM, you're categorized, okay, you have PTSD, now shop around through the list of PTSD treatments to see which one works for you. RDoC is going to say, okay, what you have is not PTSD, what you have is not enough emotions or too much emotions, and therefore these are the treatments that work for that. Accordingly, classic exposure therapies for PTSD might be predicted to be effective only for highly fear-reactive patients, where the fear can be extinguished, where different therapies may be indicated for those with blunted response pattern. So yeah, this is maybe a little bit wordy. I think it's fine. It pretty clearly says you might want to use a different treatment for people who have PTSD like lots of fear and people who have PTSD like no fear. Appropriate assessments for measuring the fear response is in a reliable ideographic manner for which there are multiple potential candidates but no validated methods would permit the test of this hypothesis, which appears to hold for other anxiety disorders as well. They didn't really give a hypothesis, but I guess the hypothesis is maybe it's better to treat the symptom or the scale of symptoms instead of the thing. So in this case, you might consider PTSD as a scale of too much fear or too little fear, and depending on where you are on the scale, you would get a different treatment. Ideographic, I believe, kind of like the word idiosyncratic, just means how you would deal with individual stuff relating to the study or discovery of particular scientific facts and processes as distinct from general laws. Okay, so that doesn't mean what it means. It means instead of looking at things as an overarching PTSD thing, we should look at scales or individual types of PTSD and therefore treatment differently. And just because we're going to have a treatment for lots of fear and too little fear doesn't mean that that's only for PTSD. Different anxiety disorders could deal with this as well. So people who are paranoia and are highly fear-oriented, maybe they could benefit from fear-reducing systems. People with depression or catatonia who exhibit low quantities of emotional response, maybe we could deal with them the same way we could deal with PTSD people who have low quantities of response. Okay, that's a pretty good sentence. I wanted to end on that. It's a good ending point because I think it shows that yes, there is good information here. There is new information here, but a lot of it is obfuscated. That means hidden by the word choices and the subconscious desires, or maybe not subconscious, like maybe this guy did want to be pompous and sound really smart, and he wrote it this way on purpose. It wouldn't make sense seeing as they had the DSM folks who were both scared and mad at this RDoC stuff, but being pompous should never help, right? Unless the DSM folks are pompous and it helps them like feel at home. Yeah, I don't know. This is coming up on an hour, so this is done. I hope you learned a little bit about how academic writing is both good and bad. People who read academic papers a lot of times feel really dumb because they don't understand the reading. And the thing is, don't feel dumb when you read academic papers. A lot of the difficulty of reading academic papers is learning how to read academic papers and ignore useless information and turn bad writing into good understanding. Plus, you learned a little bit about this RDoC stuff, which is cool. It is cool. It's just not by someone who sucks, written in a style that sucks. So there you go. This is really different from my usual videos. I'm going to send it out to some folks who might be interested in this type of editorial piece. It's a really long thing, so it might be only something you listen to in the background while you're playing your video games or something. But I'll put it up on YouTube, see what people think. And maybe I'll do other sorts of ranty, learny-y type of things like this in the future. So for now, I'm Gabriel, and I'll see you later.